In this lesson, we'll implement our Find Artist functionality and use NSURLConnection to retrieve data from the iTunes Search API. Before we begin, I've got a couple more categories on my desktop that we'll want to add to the project, as we'll need them as we implement our service methods. You'll find a copy of these in your working files directory. I'll select all of these and drag and drop them into my categories group. I want to say copy, create groups for any added folders, and make sure we have the correct targets, so just the iMusic target. Say finish, and there they are. All right, on to our implementation. The Foundation framework provides a class called NSURLConnection that's used to perform various network operations. Although it's primarily used for issuing HTTP requests, it can really be used to load any resource reachable via a URL. We'll use this class to perform an asynchronous GET request to retrieve the data needed by our search UI. So let's start implementing this code. I'll add an import for the category we'll need. I'll then create a define to define a string for our URL that we'll be calling. Let me shrink down the left side of this. This is just a format string like we've seen many times throughout the course. The one placeholder value I have is for our search term that we'll be entering in. I'll then define a class extension to define some private properties we'll need, specifically this NSURLConnection and NSMutableData, which is an object-oriented wrapper around a byte buffer, essentially, and then our service completion block. I'll go and synthesize those properties. Then inside the Find Artist by Artist Name method, I'll first store away that completion block. We'll begin by creating an NSURL based on the format string we defined above, and I'll pass in the artist name into that placeholder value. I added a category method called URLEncodedString, and this will just make sure that whatever our query term is that we entered in gets properly escaped so it can be passed as part of a HTTP request. I'll then define what's called an NSURL request. Whereas the URL defines what we're attempting to get, the URL request will define how we go about getting that resource. In this case, we can simply call request with URL and don't need to perform any further configuration. I'll then initialize this NSMutableData, and this will be essentially a byte buffer for us to accumulate the response coming back from the server. And then finally, I'll create an actual NSURLConnection using this connection with request delegate call. As soon as this method is invoked, it will kick off the actual request. We've marked ourselves as the delegate so that we can participate in this request response process. But before we can do that, we need to implement some of the delegate callback methods. The first one I'll implement is connection did receive response. If the remote server handled the request and is providing a response, this method will get invoked. For a single request, this method could be invoked multiple times, depending on potential redirects happening on the server side. So each time this gets called, we want to make sure we truncate our response data so that we're not holding old values from the previous request. We'll then implement connection did receive data. And this will be called as the remote server is writing out its response. The web server is going to rarely send back a response in a single shot, and instead we'll fill up a buffer and then flush that to the output stream, fill up the buffer, and keep flushing until that entire response is completed. So for most requests, this method will be invoked multiple times. And each time it is, we simply want to append to our mutable data. I'll then implement the connection did fail with error method. And in this case, I'm just going to nil out our response data and connection properties so they can be freed up. And then finally, this connection did finish loading will be called once the response is complete and we've captured all of the response data. For the time being, I'm simply going to create an NS string based on that response data that we received and simply log that to the console. All right, so our basic request response handling is complete. Let's switch over to the Search Artist View controller and hook in this code. I'll first import our music store service. I'll define a property for that service and synthesize it. In the ViewDidLoad, I'll create an instance of the music store service. We want to actually call this service in the search bar search button clicked. So as the user is entered in a search term and press the search button, we want to invoke this code. So I'll delete the existing methods in here with the exception of the resign first responder call. We'll then call our service method, find artist by artist name, and we'll pass in the search bar as text. So this will allow us to find the user input. Define our completion block. In our completion block, if the error parameter was populated, we'll just pop up a UI alert view, so just a standard pop-up message indicating that some problem happened. If not, we'll want to set our artist property to the result parameter coming back. And finally, we want to call TableView reload data. This will ensure that our TableView data source methods get re-invoked and can redraw the table correctly. Let's hit Command B to see if everything compiles correctly. Let's run the app. I'll open up the search UI and enter in Trivium. Tap the search button. Now we're not getting anything in our UI yet, but what we can see in the console is that we received a response from the server. And we'll look at this response in more detail in the near future. Our service is coming along nicely. We've created an NSURLConnection instance, implemented its various callback methods, and we now have the basic request-response cycle working. You should now have a good working understanding of how to issue a request and receive a response using the NSURLConnection class.